In the frozen winter of 1940, while Europe burned, Britain stood alone. The skies over London had been won. The Luftwaffe had failed to break the Royal Air Force, but victory in the air hid a deeper truth on the ground. London was burning. Factories were rubble. Ports were choked with wreckage. And beneath Whitehall, far from the cheering crowds, the British government was confronting a reality more dangerous than German bombs. The empire was running out of money, not running low, running out. On the world map, Britain still looked enormous. Pink shaded a quarter of the globe. But empires are not sustained by maps. They are sustained by cash. And Britain had none. Winston Churchill, the voice of defiance, the symbol of resistance, sat underground and began writing a letter he never wanted history to read closely. It was addressed to Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message was carefully worded, polished with Churchill's unmatched command of language. But beneath the rhetoric was a confession. Britain could fight. Britain would fight. But Britain could no longer pay. The nation that had financed wars for centuries, the banker of Europe, the workshop of the world, was bankrupt. When war began in 1939, Britain was still wealthy. Gold reserves, foreign investments, factories, railways, mines across the Americas. British money sat inside American industry itself. But this was not a war of muskets and marching men. It was a war of machines, steel, oil, rubber, aluminum, and Britain imported almost all of it. When Hitler sealed Europe, Britain's only lifeline stretched across the Atlantic to a nation that did not want this war. America was officially neutral, and neutrality had a price. If Britain wanted weapons, it would pay cash. No loans, no credit, no mercy. For a year, Britain sold its wealth piece by piece. Gold crossed the Atlantic in guarded convoys. Securities vanished into North American vaults. By late 1940, the vaults were empty. Orders for planes sat unsigned. Factories waited for payments that would never come. Britain had reached the end of its reserves. That letter from Churchill was not diplomacy. It was insolvency. Roosevelt understood the danger. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would follow. But he also understood American politics. He could not give aid openly, not without backlash, not without consequence. So he reframed survival as business. Thus, Lend-Lease was born. Not charity, a transaction. A nation on fire borrowing a hose on paper. In reality, the negotiations were colder. Before America would help, Britain had to prove something, that it had nothing left. American officials demanded full disclosure. Every asset, every investment, every overseas holding. The British were stunned. They were not treated as allies. They were treated as a collapsing firm. Factories in America owned by British companies were targeted. Crown jewels of overseas wealth were marked for sale. Not tomorrow, now, at any price. One sale became symbolic. A massive industrial corporation, profitable, strategic, vital, was forced onto the market. Everyone knew Britain was desperate, so buyers waited and waited. The company sold for a fraction of its value. The cash went to Washington. The loss stayed in London. That was the moment Britain understood. This was not partnership. This was liquidation. The same logic applied to geography. Britain needed ships. America had old destroyers gathering dust. The trade seemed simple, but the cost was permanent. Bases, ports, airfields, across the Atlantic world. For ships barely fit for modern war, Britain surrendered strategic ground that would shape global power for generations. This was survival by sacrifice, not victory. When Lend-Lease finally passed, Britain was alive, but hollowed out, gold gone, assets sold, influence leased. Publicly, it was called solidarity. Privately, it was dependency. And buried deep in the agreement was a clause that sealed the empire's fate. Britain would dismantle its imperial trade system, the economic glue that bound the empire together. It had no choice. Bombers were overhead. The Atlantic was hostile. The ink dried. When America entered the war, the imbalance deepened. British factories produced only weapons. American factories produced weapons and the future. Cars, appliances, machines. Markets Britain abandoned were filled by American goods. By the time victory approached, the shift was irreversible. The center of global wealth had crossed the ocean. When the war ended, Britain expected relief. Instead, the lifeline was cut, abruptly, completely. Ships turned around mid-Atlantic. Supplies vanished overnight. Britain stood victorious and instantly bankrupt. Economists saw collapse coming. There was only one option: beg. A sick, exhausted John Maynard Keynes went to Washington, not as a genius, as a petitioner. He asked for justice. What he received was a lot.